Hello and welcome to the last of these interviews that I'm doing with people around the university about the death of George Floyd. I'm really happy to be joined today by Manjinder Kaur Jagdev. Manjinder, welcome.
Thank you.
He is a senior lecturer in education, and I'm delighted to have you here today. It's a difficult subject that we're talking about, and quite an emotional one as well for many people. So my question to you is, how did the death of George Floyd affect you?
Okay, so I'll talk about it on three fronts, really, Jane. So personally, obviously, I reflected a lot on, what I saw on the news. I talked about it with my family, including my young nephews. I have two nephews who are primary school age children. And obviously, they saw details and on news round as well. You can't get away from social media, even with children. And we discussed what racism is. We discussed the police. We discussed the history. We talked a little bit about the civil rights movement. They learned about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Nelson Mandela. We used a lot of materials from BBC Bite Size, for example, and it really raised their awareness of why and how people are treated differently. And they felt it was really wrong. They had lots to say on the subject matter, even though, they're only, now they're 6 and 9. So last year, obviously, they were a year younger. And I think it's really important for children to be given that voice, no matter how young they are, and to be listened to. Obviously, in my wider circle, I talked about it with extended family who are of my age, my cousins. I talked about it with friends, both white friends and black friends, Asian friends. And some of them were going on their own marches, like my friend in Sheffield, their own walks. And we shared information about Black Lives Matter. I visited my local bookshop here because I wanted to educate myself on the issues. And there was a huge surge in demand for books worldwide on these issues. And I, wrote some emails to the manager about having diversity in the bookshop. Another thing I organised for my local community, I live in a very small town, the smallest county in England, called Rutland. And I shared details on our local community forum and on our local radio about a peace walk that I wanted to do. And I really did want to do it as a peaceful walk, as opposed to a protest or a demonstration. And I, with a local police officer, we discussed the route that we wanted to take, which would be socially distanced, wearing face masks, families staying in groups. And on the day, I was so surprised, 120 people turned up. It was amazing. I didn't expect that many people. Families, people on their own, people with little children, babies. And we walked from our local library on the high street, just about a 10-minute walk, maybe the amount of time, George Floyd had been on the floor, very short walk to the church where there's a green area. And we all sat down and we walked in silence, and it was a Saturday afternoon. And, the police coordinated it all. They were absolutely fantastic. And then when we got to the green, everybody sat on the grass, and somebody asked me if I would say a few words, which I did, about why we were there. Somebody said that if anybody wanted to, we could take the knee. And I said, if people felt comfortable, they could. If not, it was absolutely fine. And then after that, I mingled to talk to as many people as possible and asked them why they were here. And there was a huge range of people from all backgrounds. And many families said that they really wanted to educate their children. They're trying to create a better society for their children, and that's why they were there. Many people came with placards and were swapping placards. A few people asked me, oh, can I have the ones that you've written? Yeah, it was really quite moving. Yeah. So that's on a personal front. And then on a professional front, last summer I was working at my previous institution, and every year for the last 15 years, and even when I was a secondary school maths teacher, I always teach historical and cross-cultural roots of mathematics. Maths is a universal language. You know, there are contributions to mathematics from all over the world over centuries, you know. And every year my students get together in groups and they create lesson plans that they're then going to use in their classrooms to teach, you know, contributions from the Arab world, the Egyptians, the Indians, etc., 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 the Chinese, as well as the European contributions. But last year I wanted to do a second session as a follow-up, which was looking at what was happening in America, you know, what had happened with George Floyd, because many of my students were quite affected by it. So we discussed things like white privilege, we discussed unconscious bias. There's quite a well-known paper by Peggy McIntosh that I got the students to read. And we discussed about the national curriculum and what perhaps was lacking in the national curriculum that could help children in the classroom. And then when I did my one-to-one tutorials with my students, because obviously we were all in lockdown, we discussed what they were feeling. Many of them were quite affected by what they saw on the news in terms of the protests, global protests. And we discussed what they wanted to do in their classrooms, implications for their practice, what they could do with children, what discussions and what conversations and what activities they could have with children to raise these issues and hopefully make society a better, fairer place with more equal opportunity. Because, you know, they felt that those conversations were really important. They also talked, I was quite surprised at how in tune they were with history. You know, they talked about the civil rights movement. They talked about, you know, why are we still having these conversations today? Some of them talked about what had happened with the Native Americans, you know, when the first colonizers arrived. So they were really fruitful discussions with the students. And then this year, since I joined York St John in November, a group of us have set up, you know, the anti-racist decolonisation teams group. We worked towards a workshop that happened in February. And in the lead up to that, we created a Padlet for students and colleagues at the university to contribute any ideas that they felt could be used in teaching, or ideas on those issues of anti-racism and decolonisation. And it was great during the workshop. We could share that Padlet and people could continue to add to the Padlet. Staff and students contributed at the workshop, as well as a brilliant guest speaker, Dr. Gurnam Singh. And then since then, our team page has become live to anybody who wants to join, any staff, any colleague. And people are posting things from all different schools if they've got something going on. Certainly I've joined in activities from other schools apart from, you know, education. And also in my own work, we're looking at ideas that we as teacher educators can use with our student teachers. So we've created our own Padlet in initial teacher education that colleagues are using across all subjects. And also we're looking at reaching out to partnership schools now and working with primary and secondary schools about how we can change the national curriculum. Conversations are happening nationally. There is something called the anti-racist curriculum that has been started at grassroots level by teachers, and many schools across several cities have signed up to it already, like Manchester, Sheffield, Birmingham, Leicester, London, and it's really heartening to see that there is a real demand for that, regardless of, government policy. The other thing I wanted to add, without, going too much into politics, is that those conversations that are happening in schools, by school leaders on anti-racist practices, teachers are finding really helpful. And it is all about making ourselves individually, but as groups, aware about systems of racism and reflection. It's really important that we spend time talking about these issues, and certainly we're doing that at York St John. There are concepts, there are research that people can read around. There's a lot of research now on decolonisation, but also critical race theory. And it's just time that people need to get their heads around, these concepts. And teachers are saying that they're finding it really helpful because it's giving them an insight into the history, like, for example, anti-racist movements like, multiculturalism in the 1980s, community cohesion, which came out following Stephen Lawrence's murder, and, in the 1990s. And teachers are beginning to have a better understanding. Obviously, it's not a quick fix. This is a very, very long process, but just having time to talk about, race, what race means, what ethnicity means, what culture means. And then over time, we can think about changing curriculum. We can have activities in assemblies. We can talk about equality and diversity. So at this stage, it's about consciousness raising, really, in teachers and educators.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Manjinder. And I think as you talk about decolonisation particularly, and looking at changing the national curriculum and that sort of thing, there's such an energy about that now. And I know when I looked at the Padlets that you did, I was blown away by the creativity that was in that, and the energy and the inspiration. And I think it's such a tragedy that it took a horrific death to get people to really wake up and get hold of these things, because I think this is something that we've needed to do for decades, centuries, and we're just finally starting to get hold of it. And so George Floyd, I think for me, there's an amazing legacy that he's given, but it's just awful that it had to start with his death.
Yeah, but I think also, Jane, that's happened, centuries before George Floyd as well, and it's continued to happen. There were
absolutely.
the
He
very
was
same
just
week,
one of,
and it maybe the fact that it was on social media, it's captured, and how easy it is now for that to go global. That's why it was so impactful. But we mustn't forget those incidents happen all the time, everywhere.
They've continued to happen since then.
There are many. And yes, the verdict was the right verdict, but we have to change systems. It's more than just one person. There are ingrained systems, both in this country and in America and in other countries all around the world. And that's why this conversation at this stage, this consciousness raising, is so key to making positive changes for the next generation, tackling racial injustice, as well as, climate justice, for example, which is linked to racial justice when we talk about colonization and, people going to different countries and taking away, extracting. And it's really important that we educate our next generation so that they will be problem solvers, to solve these massive issues that we have in society, in the world today. And that's why it's important for us to talk to young children from primary aged, it's never too early, and look about what we're doing in schools so that those children can come out and be better leaders, be better policy makers, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, huge amounts of work to be done. And we are out of time for our short conversation today. Thank you so much for joining me today and having this conversation. And I'm going to look forward to seeing you around campus when we're finally back there. And maybe you and I will be able to carry on the conversation.
Most definitely. Thank you, Jane. Thank you for your time.